Welcome back to another episode of Wicked Darkness. I'm Kathy, your host, and with me tonight I have Mika.
Hey.
I have Steve.
Hello.
I have Kevin.
Hello.
And I have Renee. So,
Hi.
Renee, you lived in
I'm
Wyoming
breaking
for a
up.
while. And you have a pretty interesting story and something that you were involved with. That is known
Yes.
as the Wyoming Territorial Prison, or also a former federal prison near Laramie, Wyoming. Correct?
Yes, correct.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about this? First of all, how did you get started with this whole prison situation?
So I actually was a student at the University of Wyoming. I was getting my master's degree, and it's one of those buildings that you notice when you go into Laramie. Laramie isn't very big, and so it's one of the more prominent historic buildings there. It's near the river, the Laramie River, and so when you come around on Snowy Range, and you take that corner, it's the first thing you see. It's very, imposing, and it's made out of, sandstone, and it sits right there on the river. And so I needed a summer job, between my first and second year of my school year, and I ended up working there as a summer tour guide. And so I did that for the summer into October. My degree was in history, and so it was also in museum studies. And so that's how I kind of got into working there at the prison. After I graduated, I went back to Los Angeles, lived there for a little over a year, and the curator who worked there at the prison actually quit. And I called the superintendent and I said, "Hey, what do I need to do to get back in there so I can, be the curator?" And she said, "Well, we're a little short on tour guides right now. You're more than welcome to come out." And the rest is history. I worked there for the summer again, and then applied for the job, interviewed, and 2 weeks later, I was hired as the curator of the territorial prison there in Laramie.
Nice.
Yeah.
So the building was built in 1872, correct?
Correct. Right.
Okay, so now I've been out west before. I've been to Wyoming. I don't remember. I'm sure I went to Laramie when I was a kid. More of Cheyenne than anything.
Right.
But I know that the gunslingers, the outlaws, and all that, they're very prevalent out there. There isn't a prison that hasn't had some kind of outlaw that, Jesse James, Doc Holliday, those names that people know, Billy the Kid and all that.
Right.
How many were there that were the famous gunslingers?
So the one famous one that everybody is going to know is Butch Cassidy. Butch Cassidy was the prisoner that had the name, and he got kind of already started getting a name for himself in Wyoming when he was put in prison. What's interesting is he was put in prison initially for buying a stolen horse. It wasn't even like anything that great, and so, it wasn't like, oh, this bank robbery and this and that and a great story. Nope, he just bought a stolen horse. The judge that sentenced him was a little uneasy about the way the trial proceeded. And so as soon as he was sentenced, they started a petition to get him pardoned. And so a lot of people signed it because Butch Cassidy was very charismatic. As the movie kind of alludes to also.
Mm-hmm.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and a lot of books and a lot of, things that people have written. He was very charismatic, very much a smooth talker. And so he kind of smooth talked the judge, and they got him pardoned. He served about 18 months of his 2-year sentence. And then once he was pardoned, that's when he really let loose, and that's when the bank robberies start, the train robberies start, the Wilcox train robbery, and all the stuff that he's known for. And then he moves to, or leaves to, Argentina, and that's where his quote unquote demise happens. Still unsure if he died in Argentina or if he came back. There's that whole mystery behind his story. And so he's one of the more famous ones that the prison can say, hey, we had him here.
So the prison itself, I mean, I'm assuming back then it was by itself. There wasn't a lot that was around it, like
Right.
It's out in the, I don't know, sandy desert wilderness area. I don't know exactly how to describe it back then, but
Right.
so how big is the actual prison? Do you how many people could be in the prison at the time?
I think we lost her.
I think we did.
So in the prison at the time we had about, yeah,
there, you're back. The glitch is over. Maybe.
Yeah. She's thinking really hard.
am I here? Sorry. Can you hear me?
You're here.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of
Okay, good.
freezing.
There's a glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, we moved into a new apartment, so we're kind of getting all of our technology down and everything. So yeah, things are a little kooky right now. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
No worries.
So what was the question again? I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's one of those things that happens.
Yeah.
So how big is the actual prison?
So the prison is there's a north and the south cell block. So the north block, or what we call the north cell block, that was built in 1872. In 1889, they built the center administrative section, and then they built the south cell block. So each cell block has 3 levels with 7 cells per level. So doing the math, and I always make the 4th graders do the math, so I never do the math, but 7, so you got 14 cells per level times 3. So that's
42.
Thank you. I became a history major, not a math major.
Teamwork makes the dream work, I tell you around here.
Absolutely. And so you have the same, it's mirrored on both the north and the cell block. And you usually have about two prisoners or convicts per cell. So just a little under 200 you can house at a time. The most prisoners they had was about 220.
Wow.
And so it was overcrowded for, I think, starting in about 1900 to about 1903 when the prison shut its doors.
And how was the amenities that were in the prison? I mean, was it just like you land on the floor, or did they, I mean, how was their cells?
They had, so the cells itself were 6 by 6 by 8. So they were 8 tall and then 6 by 6, right? Yeah. So very small. Like I said, 2 prisoners per cell, and they did have beds. So they had bunk beds.
Okay.
No running water, no toilet. So they used a cell bucket that was emptied every morning. And that was about it. They were given a blanket, their prisoner pants, shirt, a little hat to wear. In the winter, they were given a jacket, but very bare bones.
Were they able to leave the cell to go get exercise or anything like that? Like nowadays these guys get to do, or just stuck in the 6 by 6?
Yep, they worked. So they were, for a time they were working. They were either working outside harvesting ice on the Laramie River during the winter, or they were making bricks, or they were breaking down boxcar houses because it was near the railroad. And then after 1889, they started making brooms. And so that became the primary job that the prisoners had, was making brooms. And in fact, the broom factory still operates to this day. So,
Wow.
yeah, so they actually make brooms there at the prison. But as far as exercise, that was a no-go. It was very limited. Whatever exercise they got was when they were working. And then it was silent. It was a silent prison. So reminiscent of Eastern State Penitentiary, that same Auburn prison system where it's complete silence. The punishments were very harsh. So you had solitary confinement. You had, they were shackled to their cells, bread and water. There was never anything in the punishment books that says they were beaten, but it probably happened.
So you
it's not written.
said that they had solitary confinement. Where was the solitary confinement at?
So it was, according to the punishment book that we were able to get a hold of from the archives, there was a couple of dungeons. There was also some that were outside, like in ditches, kind of. And so they would put them there. There was also solitary, or the dark cell, as they called it, inside the prison. There was 4. So 2 on one side, 2 on the other.
Okay. Because I know I've been to a jail before. It was in Indiana that we did an investigation at, and they had the solitary confinement was in the basement in these tunnels, and there wasn't any windows or anything, and they had the shackles like hanging from the ceiling, and that's how these guys would just like hang from the ceiling basically, and it was like dirt floors.
Right.
So
But
Wyoming is known for like harsh winters and cold. So I mean, did they have a way of heating this prison, or was it just here's your jacket, here's your bed,
right,
tough it out?
They did steam heat when they built the new wing. They started using steam heat. Prior to that, they used fireplaces. In fact, 2 weeks after they built the north cell block, there was a fire in the chimney. And so there was a roof fire and then they didn't fix it for like 6 months until a prisoner escaped through the hole. And then they decided maybe we should fix it now. And so they fixed it.
Oops.
It was a federal prison at the time, and it was kind of like, oh, okay, I guess we'll fix it. But yeah, it was very cold. There wasn't there was reports of men waking up with, ice on their pillows. And it gets cold and windy. Wyoming is known for the wind, and out where the prison is situated, back then there was like nothing. It was all sagebrush, no trees, so there was nothing to break the wind. And so with the winter, what is that? The wind chill at like negative, I don't know, 38 maybe at times. So it gets cold.
how many guards were there? Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin.
No, I was just gonna say, it sounds like it was a very hard labor camp type styled prison. You worked, you went back to your cell, you worked, you went back to your cell.
Yeah.
And don't talk to anybody.
Right. That was the number one rule broken, was the no talking rule.
How many guards was at this prison that was taking care of these 200 guys?
So it depends on the population. So for a time, the prison had maybe like 10 prisoners. Because what they were also doing is they were also sending prisoners over to Joliet. So they were sending them there. They were sending them to Nebraska. And they were like, I don't want to say leasing them because that sounds very bad, but Wyoming was being paid to send their prisoners elsewhere, or they were paying to send their prisoners elsewhere, and it was cheaper than keeping them there in Wyoming. So that was during that federal penitentiary time. Once it came back over to the state, all the prisoners were brought back, and that's when they did the expansion. And then the prisoners were no longer shipped out to other prisons. So guards can range anywhere between 5 to, I think, 25 at the most is what they had. And in the beginning, most of these guys were Civil War soldiers. So no formal training for guards, not like now, right?
Mm.
So you're dealing with a lot of prisoners that have mental illness. You're dealing with prisoners that are murderers. You're dealing with prisoners that, are just bad people all around. And these guards have no training in anything other than how to be a soldier, right? So the turnover rate was very, very high for prison guards.
Not to mention they're dealing with their own PTSD from the Civil War.
Absolutely.
Wow. So when you started working there, did you know that the location was haunted? I mean, everybody thinks, oh, it's an old building,
Right.
it's suspicious, it could be haunted. Did you have an aha moment of, holy crap, this place is actually haunted?
Yeah, so we did, as I was working as a seasonal, we did some night tours, and it was kind of to bring a different audience to the prison because, it hadn't been, the audience hadn't been diversified enough, as far as it was mainly older folks coming in that were coming on vacation that stopped by. So we were trying to get a younger crowd in there. And so the curator at the time was like, hey, let's do a night tour and we'll do it lantern led. So I was like, okay, that sounds fun. So I was tasked with putting the lanterns in the different place in the prison. And so I had about 15 lanterns with me, and I walked into the prison. And as soon as I walked into that front door, all I felt was just it was heavy. Walking in, there was just this, it was like walking almost through a wall. And I stood there in the doorway, and I looked around, and it was getting dark, and there's no lights. There's hardly any lights in the prison as it is. And I just felt instantly like I was being watched. And so I dropped off the first 3 lanterns. And as soon as I got into the north cell block to walk into the cell to put the 4th lantern, I was like, nope, I'm done. And so I turned around, walked out, and then it felt like a weight was lifted off me as soon as I walked out the door. And so I was standing outside the door, and I called the curator and I said, hey, can I just have somebody help me out with the lanterns? Because there's a lot of lanterns, and I was trying to make up a story so it didn't seem like I was being a chicken or anything. And they sent someone out, and then it felt, when I walked back in, it felt different. It didn't feel as heavy. So it was just like almost the shift in how the feeling. Mm-hmm. And then just kind of throughout that night, there was always just this weird, oh, something's watching. And it just felt off.
Did they ever have any women at this prison? Or was it just men that were there?
There were 12 women that were in the prison. And what was different about them was they weren't allowed out of their cells at all. So they were in a separate area, and pretty much 24/7 they were in there. So it was almost like solitary confinement for the women.
Wow.
And having male guards, so there's the assumption that things were done, but there was nothing really written.
Mm-hmm.
Because who's going to write down what they did, right? I
right.
mean, so you have women in there, it's just a recipe for who knows what, honestly.
Is that, with you saying that you went into this area and it's like, here's a woman walking in by herself into an area that usually has men in there only, and yeah, it's spirit world, but things don't change. Mm-mm. When it comes to that situation. That Absolutely same energy is there from when they were alive to now. And I know what you're talking about, that feeling of that wall. I've experienced that at one of the hospitals. Well, it's I'll just say it's not Randolph, but Ashmore Estates. I had that same thing. I went onto the 3rd floor putting stuff out to put the equipment out, and I felt like I should not go any farther than this. So it was that heaviness, that wall. So I know what you're talking about. And that was up on the hospital wing of it. And I think that's where they were doing like lobotomies and stuff like that and electric shock therapy to the people. But I know that you're talking about that wall.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear anything while you were walking through the halls that were not of the living?
A lot of footsteps, whistles. So when we're working there, there's certain things that you have to do, especially in the winter, when there isn't a whole lot of people coming through. I mean, who wants to go to Wyoming in the winter? It's really cold. So we did a lot of our cleaning of the prison, of the exhibits during the winter. And actually my first 3 years working there, we actually shut down during the winter. And so we knew for sure nobody was there. And it was probably it was my first year. I want to say it was probably around November. And I was doing some cleaning in one of the areas. And the upstairs area where the dining hall is, it's wooden floors. So you can hear somebody walking across the dining hall. And I heard like boots walking on the floor upstairs. And I popped my head out of the room I was in and I was like, hello? Of course, no answer. And so I radioed and I asked if any maintenance were in the prison, hey, just let me know you guys are in here because I'm by myself. And nobody was around. Everybody was in their office. And at that point, my boss is like, you need to go make sure no one's up there. And I was like, okay. Here we go. So I took the elevator because there was an elevator that they installed in the prison when they did the reconstruction. And so went up the elevator, and as the elevator starts opening, it was like, please do not let anybody be standing there because I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I searched the entire prison and there was nothing. Nobody was in there. And yeah, it was probably one of my first, definitely not the last experience with footsteps. And then as far as whistles, that was multiple times hearing a whistle when there was nobody in the prison. It was just one of those, did I hear what I thought I heard? And
so is that like a guard whistle you're describing, or is it like men whistling, or?
Yeah, like men whistling, like a guy kind of using his mouth to whistle.
How bizarre.
Yeah.
I've heard that several times in other places. A man whistling, always the same kind of whistle too, which I think is weird. I also have heard that on some of the shows on TV, that same whistle, which is kind of bizarre. But yeah, I've heard that several times.
Yeah, and
we've had that too, like at a residence that we did an investigation years and years ago, and we were in the maid quarters, and one of the members was whistling downstairs, but the whistle that we heard was not that whistle. So we had them do it again, and we're like, that is not that whistle. But yeah, same thing. It's a whistle, and it was somebody whistling. Not blowing on a whistle or anything.
Right.
But yeah, it catches it off guard, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was a little unnerving, but it was one of those things, working there almost 10 years, you kind of learn to live with it in a way. And you learn to live with who's there or what's there. And you you end up being very, it's almost like a very symbiotic relationship, in the mornings when I would open up the prison, hey, good morning, boys, walk in and, acknowledge them. And then at night when I'm closing up, all right, good night. And so it's this very, friendly type relationship that I had with who or what was there.
Did you ever get a response like when you're welcoming and saying goodbye?
Oh gosh, no. I'm not sure what I would have done.
That'd be very interesting, I'd say awesome, but yeah, that would be a little unnerving at the same time.
Yeah, but it was just, and then I learned a path going through there where the lights would be the last thing for me to turn off, because the way my coworkers would do it, they'd turn off the lights first and then walk through. And I was like, why would you do that? Why would you not turn those off last? And so I had a route that I would do, and I'd start upstairs, work my way down, locking all the doors, and then the last thing would be to turn off the lights. And then I'd walk out the back door and, okay, good night, boys, and then be done, rather than sprint through a dark prison.
So did you guys know of an actual spirit that haunted the location by name or anything, or by any kind of identity?
We didn't. We never really got a straight answer. We did multiple investigations. When I started my 4th year, I convinced my supervisor to let us do ghost hunts and to kind of open up. She was very much against it and very much adamant that she didn't want, those type of people in there kind of thing.
Right.
And so I reassured her that I would be with them the entire night, and that I would make sure that, things would not be tampered with as far as like our artifacts, and that I would kind of, just be that eye to make sure the prison was taken care of. The things that we used were, the spare boxes, and never really got a name, just a description. There was a man upstairs, and he was a very dominant man who was upstairs, and it was up in the dining hall, and then it led into the women's section, and it was almost like he was kind of holding domain over that area. And I'm thinking that's where the footsteps came into play, because it would almost be like he was pacing back and forth between the dining hall and then the women's section. And that's where 7 people, we had a small group, we were leading an investigation, and 7 people saw a shadow go in, like kind of peek in from the doorway to the dining hall, into the doorway into where the elevator area is. And so that was really interesting for a lot of the investigators. I was upset because I wasn't one of them, but it was one of those, just a full shadow, so it was really interesting.
Did it seem like it was more of a prisoner kind of spirit, or do you think it was more like a guard?
I think it was more of a guard.
Yeah.
I think it was more of a guard.
Yeah. Maybe that's them patrolling,
Yeah.
The
going
back
and forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you guys ever, like, besides the one, did you guys ever see or hear or smell anything else in the prison itself? That's in the prison, but I mean anywhere else in the building?
Oh, so we had like folks that said they smelled cigars.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, because I remember reading somewhere there was a prisoner there that made cigars. They let him make cigars.
Yeah, Julius Greenwald. He's one of the 2 that did die there at the prison. He died of a heart attack, and he's said to still roam around, and a lot of people get that sweet smell of cigar, like in the area where his cell was. The other one was William. Of course, his last name escapes me, but he had leprosy. And so he was actually outside in a shed. And so he ended up dying out there of pneumonia. And so those are the only 2 deaths that occurred in the prison. Because we were a federal prison, we didn't have an execution area. So we didn't have a hanging area or a gas chamber, because we were too short. It was only 30 years that it was a prison. And so the executions were done at the county level. And so they weren't done at the federal level at that time period. So it wasn't until they built the prison in Rawlins where they actually built the gallows, and then they built the gas chamber.
Did you ever try using their prison numbers to try to get a response from them?
All the time. We
Yeah.
would use prison numbers, we would use names. Because we think there was like not only the prison, but then once the prison shut down, it became part of the university. And then it was the university's ag school for, gosh, almost 80 years, 80, 90 years. And so there were some accidents that happened also in there regards to like ag accidents. There was a guy who fell in the horse barn from the top. There was which is now the theater, but there was where they stored the hay up at the top,
Mhm.
and he actually fell to his death from there. So he died there on the property, not in the prison. And then there was 2 other deaths that happened around the property during that ag period.
Now,
But-
has there been any sightings around the property itself? Has anybody ever experienced anything outside the prison?
Not
Since
that I've
it's
heard.
on the university? How close is it to the university?
Not very close.
No?
It's probably, gosh, I'm terrible at directions. It's about a 10-minute drive, maybe 5-minute drive.
Well, that's a Midwest answer, so we're good there.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
We don't do
Yeah, it's
mileage. We just do like how long
Yeah.
it's going to take you to get there. We're good. 10
It's 10
minutes. All
minutes.
right.
Yeah, it's 5 to 10 minutes if you're going from the prison to the university.
Okay.
Yeah. So the prison sits over on the west side of Laramie, and then the university is kind of in the middle of town. So they kind of built the town around the university. And the railroad is just, you can see the railroad from the front door of the prison.
Okay.
The railroad sits right there. So you got the river and then the railroad just out beyond that.
So you said that there were people that, because of the ceiling collapsing in, that they escaped. Was there any other escapes or?
Oh yeah. The first year there were 18 prisoners. 8 of them escaped and were never found.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so it was a very high escape rate. And that kind of continued. Only because one, the guards weren't paid enough, I think, to really
Care?
chase after, care. Yeah, absolutely. We had, let's see, one prisoner actually with the snowdrift was able to run up the snowdrift and go over the fence during the winter. And so I'm sure the guards were just kind of like, okay, go ahead. We'll find you in the spring, if we do.
Right.
And so another prisoner escaped because he had been planning this. So this was very much pre-planned, and it's an interesting story. He had started feeding an antelope, and he ended up with a pent antelope. And this went on for about 4 months. And the guards got very comfortable with him going and, feeding the antelope until the day he escaped, when he said, I'm going to go feed my antelope. And then he never came back.
Wow.
Very
How
much.
many were able to get onto the railroad? Since you said the railroad's right there.
Yeah.
I'm assuming a lot of them are like, well, you're not going to catch me if I get on a train.
Yeah. I would say a number of them, a number of them would probably go on the railroad. I know there was one prisoner by the name of James Brown, not the Godfather of Soul, but another James Brown. He was able to escape. He was able to get a change of clothes, because mind you, these guys were in, striped pants, striped shirt, and their heads were shaved, which back then was the sign, because none of the men shaved their heads back then.
Mm-hmm.
If your head was shaved, you were probably a prisoner, and so that was kind of like the telltale sign. And so when James escaped, he was able to get some clothing and from railroad workers, somebody that left something, and he was able to grab that, and he jumped on the train. And they didn't find him until I think he was all the way in Evanston, which is in the west side of the state. And then he was brought back to Laramie.
What was the punishment if they escaped and they brought him back? Was there any
He
big
was sentenced
punishment?
another 30 years.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah,
Harsh punishment then.
very much. Very much. It was, if they caught you, they would, punish you, put you in the dark cell for 2 weeks, bread and water, shackle to your cell. Then once you got out, shackle you to your cell. They would give you the ball and chain. They would, whatever punishment they could find,
what's this? Your most punished prisoner, McKinney? What was his deal?
Kinch McKinney. His story is actually really good. So he was rustling cattle. So he said that the state line of Nebraska went through the other rancher's ranch. And so any of the cattle that was there was his, which wasn't true because his state line was off by a lot. And so he was like, oh, this cattle's on mine. It's on the Nebraska side. And they're like, no, that's Wyoming. And he's like, no. And so there was this back and forth, and turns out the cattle was not his. And so he was arrested for cattle rustling. He escaped multiple times. And because he was, again, a charismatic person, right?
Yeah.
His trial was really interesting because he was very much a ladies' man. And I wish I had his picture because he was tall for the time period, right?
Yeah.
So he was about 5'11". He had a nice mustache, great hair, thin, and he was able to he talked his way out of a lot of things. The women actually flocked to his trial, and he said that if his jury was all women, he would have gotten off. Because that's how confident he was. And so while he was in prison, he escaped. He was able to escape back to Nebraska. They found him. They brought him back. They gave him the ball and chain, and they put him in the dark cell. Then he escaped again. They found him, brought him back, ball and chain, dark cell. Then he attempted to escape, but his height and his shoulders got the best of him. So his cellmate was able to saw out a hole at the bottom of the door of the cell, but he only made it big enough for himself. So Kinch tried to shinny his way in, but got stuck. So imagine Winnie the Pooh when he gets stuck in the hole.
Yes.
Very much like that. And so the guards actually left him in there for a little bit and then pulled him out. Dark cell, ball and chain. Then he was shackled to his cell, I think, for a time period. But he took his punishments like a champ. And that was one of the things the warden said, was that he took his punishments like man. And when he left, and he was, his sentence was done, and he was, so I don't think he never got pardoned. He was just released. He actually moved up to the Lander area, Lander, Wyoming, and he started the Yellowstone Sheep Company. So he went from cows to sheep. And he ran the company up there and didn't get into trouble again. He was actually taught by a federal officer that had arrested him prior, and he taught him how to ranch and how to ranch sheep, I guess is what you would say. And he actually ended up dying in his sheep. I don't want to say RV because that is such terrible, but it was like where the sheep herders would stay in like the wagons,
Yeah.
and he ended up dying there. But yeah, he was like in his 80s, I think.
Well, I'm looking at a picture of him right now, and I'll post it on our Facebook page. But yeah, I see what you're talking about. He's taller, dark hair, mustache, yeah. And then this is like the reward poster, $500 for his for $500 for his capture or body, to notify the Laramie County Sheriff or any Wyoming police officer. And they've got a really good description of him. Like they're even talking about like the color of his hair, like he has gray eyes, and he's got a long straight nose. He's got the scar on the back of his neck and the right upper lip. His little finger on his right hand is stiff and deformed. But yeah, I'll send you guys a picture of him too. But yeah, he definitely does not look like he was a small man.
No, he was tall. I think he was probably one of our tallest prisoners, if I remember. Because each of the prisoners had like a convict card or prisoner card. So when they did intake, they height, weight, skin color, again the scars. They did a real detailed thing for each of the prisoners. Because back then, photographs really didn't do a whole lot.
Right.
So you had to really describe, the prisoners.
Yeah, it's definitely describing him, that's for sure. I mean,
oh yeah.
Well, that's it for us this episode. For our skeptics, keep us grounded. For our believers, keep believing. I'm Kathy. This is Wicked Darkness. Have a good night.